Today's speaker is Letitia Grenier. She is co-director of SFEI's Resilient Landscapes program. She is a principal investigator for the Delta Landscapes project, which has completed in-depth analysis on the change in the Delta over time and is now offering science-based guidance on how ecosystem health can be recovered as part of this working landscape. She was the science lead for both the 2015 State of the Estuary report, which was an SF Estuary partnership project, and the 2015 update to the Baylands ecosystem habitat goals, which was a California Coastal Conservancy project, where she headed over a team of 200 environmental scientists, managers, and regulators to develop science-based recommendations for restoring and maintaining the health of the bay's tidal wetland in the face of rising sea levels and other stressors. She holds a Ph.D. in conservation biology from the University of California, Berkeley, and has previously worked on investigating bioaccumulation of contaminants in estuarine food webs, the condition of California's wetlands, and other ecological questions about the bay. Her focus now is to work with partners to conserve California's living resources by developing landscape-scale collaborative visions and solutions. This talk is part of our seminar series on the State of Bay Delta Science 2016, which is a collection of papers that summarizes the scientific understanding of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. The batch of publications that includes Letitia Grenier's article on Delta Landscapes was published in July in the online journal San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science. And here's one great figure from that paper, and if you haven't had a chance to check out that paper, I highly recommend it. Here's a teaser. It's figure 1, the landscape surrounding the McCormick-Williamson tract as viewed from a variety of perspectives. And I kind of feel like I'm walking through like a Warhol museum looking at this picture, and it's really great, and a lot of other great insights in that paper. So please join me in welcoming Letitia Grenier. And I'm going to pass around a sign-in sheet. Please remember to sign in.
Thanks, Neer. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes, someone in the back can hear me. Thank you. So I'm delighted to be here to get to talk with you today. And I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion of this paper, but also very much applied to a very particular project that we've been doing. And that's called the Delta Landscapes Project. And just to give a little plug for when we're going to be talking about that more, in a couple weeks is the Bay Delta Science Conference, and we have a double session. So if you're interested in this, the pieces are going to be broken out in a lot more detail, and there will be about 8 scientists presenting, and then we have some leadership folks from around the Delta, including I think David Okita is going to speak, Carl Wilcox, Campbell Ingram, and they're going to be talking about how this will actually be applied to the real world. So I invite you to come and join us on November 15th, so the first day of that conference, 2 weeks from today, actually. But today I'm going to relate that project to this paper that we wrote for the State of the Bay Delta Science. And I just want to acknowledge my co-authors. John Weens is the first author on this article. And then me, Robin, and Michael worked on the article. And the other 3 folks, Julie, April, and Sam, are the real people that have been our staff who are actually creating all this content for the Delta Landscapes Project. And so I like that Neer and I liked the same figure from the paper. So we both focused on the same thing here. And the reason I put this down was to talk about how this paper is very much focused on using landscape ecology and landscape science to think about the Delta. And so all these different images are different layers or different types of data you can think about for the landscape scale analysis and understanding of this place. And I think it's one of the strengths of our Delta Landscapes project overall, this example that I'm going to be presenting today as our case study, that we really took this large-scale integrated systems view. So it's very much not about a single species or a single habitat type. It's about how did this big system work at the landscape scale. And if we think about it that way, from the base functions, the base physical functions that create some of the template for the ecological functions that we want, like supporting our native wildlife or supporting particular fish, that gives us a different kind of insight into what we might want to do as we think about restoring some of these functions in the Delta. And so the structure of our Delta Landscapes project was really 3 big chunks, and they were 3 large reports that analyzed how the Delta system used to work in the past, so the historical ecology. I see how the future, it's a little confusing. I don't understand how these slides change from my laptop to this laptop, but the future is the one on the right. So the first report was on how did the system used to function in the past prior to really intense modification of the landscape after European settlement of the Delta. And how does it function now? What's changed between those 2? Quite a bit of analysis on that transformation in the second report. And our third report is about to come out right at the same time for the Bay Delta Science Conference in a couple weeks. And that's going to offer visions for how we could restore the Delta, thinking at this landscape scale. And I'll be previewing some of that information today. So this, as a case study of the paper that we published for State of the Bay Delta Science, is really an implementation of those ideas. If we think about the structure and function of landscapes, if we use that body of science and apply it to some of our problems in the Delta, what would we come up with for answers? And these quotes are just to point out that that landscape view has been desired by several important documents in the Delta, so we're not just sort of coming out of science left field here, but we're actually relating to the Water Code, to the Delta Plan, and then we quoted the same paper here at the bottom. So this is really about taking a landscape perspective, thinking across large scales, thinking across large spatial scales, and then also long time frames, and thinking about the connectivity of the elements of the landscape, and sometimes the disconnectivity, which is an interesting point that we'll talk about a little bit here as I go along, which is it's not necessarily true that all the different parts of the landscape have been affected the same way. So the way that our wetlands and our upland habitats have been affected is really different than the way that the water and aquatic habitats have been affected. Okay, so let's think about what the Delta used to be like, let's say around 1800. And, you know, it's had similar channels in some ways, but it was a big wetland. And so what was in between the channels was very different, and the form of the channels was different. If we zoom out a little bit more, this is a rendering of what we think that might have looked like. There were some ponds, there were riparian areas around the fluvial channels, and in between you had a lot of marsh. Most of it was tidal marsh. This is what the Delta looks like now. And so I just want to start out with this comparison, just so everybody, just visually you can see that it's nearly 100% transformation. The only thing that's really recognizable is some of the shapes of the channel squiggly forms, right? Everything else has pretty much changed. So if we think about how did the system used to work historically, just very briefly thinking about it from the landscape perspective, there were these very big drivers of physical process and also climate and geology and other factors that differed across this Delta because it's really, really big, right? And remember that this is only the upper part of the estuary. It then affects the lower part of the estuary, so it's really a very large system. So the two different rivers with their different flow regimes, timing, climates, flow into the Delta, but that's not the only rivers that come here. They create gradients of sediment supply, temperature, some chemical gradients coming into the center of the Delta, but there's also several smaller rivers. So really this is an interesting place with a lot of deltas coming together and then behind the constriction point so that you get this really interesting kind of unique inland giant marsh is what you used to have historically. But it wasn't all the same across the north, middle, and south of the Delta. So they were quite different landscapes. In the north, you had a landscape that was really driven by the fluvial processes of the Sacramento River. So very high sediment supply, big floods. You had these big basin floods that lasted for months going down each side of the river. So you had this incredible floodplain productivity, and we'll see more maps of that in a minute. In the central Delta, you had much more of a tidal marsh-driven system with these large marsh islands and not so much of those high natural levees because it was more tidally dominated rather than fluvially dominated. And then in the South Delta, it was more of a complex habitat mosaic, a different kind of timing for the flooding, and you tended to get more oxbows and off-channel aquatic habitats. So it wasn't really homogeneous. It was a complex place, and I'll show you a little bit more about that with the flooding later. Throughout this project, the Delta Landscapes Project, we've really relied on our science partners to give us input, oversight, make sure we're using the best available science. And we call them the Landscape Interpretation Team, but it's really a science advisory team. And these are the folks who are on it. It's kind of an all-star cast of experts on a lot of different aspects of the biology and physical processes in the Delta. Okay, you guys might be able to read this. This is the structure that we use to think about how we can actually approach this landscape analysis for the Delta. What do people want the Delta to do? That's what we decided. What are we being asked to do with this project? And what we were being asked to do was come up with kind of what are the desired ecological functions. That's this yellow row here. What are the things that the Delta isn't doing that people want it to do in terms of ecological values. And so 5 of those functions are really around taxonomic groups: supporting native wildlife, supporting native fish, supporting native marsh wildlife, supporting native connectivity and habitat for water birds, et cetera. And then there were also concerns about the delta not supplying enough food or not supporting other aspects of biodiversity, or not being able to allow wildlife populations to evolve via natural selection over time. And so that's what these community level functions are over here on the right. And so we came up with this structure to try to think about how we were going to analyze change in the landscape. And then underneath each of the yellow boxes, or each function, we have some of the metrics that we use to look at that change. And the thing to know about these metrics is in landscape ecology, you typically have metrics like patch size, connectivity, nearest neighbor distance, size to area ratio, or a perimeter to area ratio, shape, essentially. And what we realized is when we did those very simple landscape ecology metrics, they weren't getting us close enough to these functions. What we had to do was layer them really carefully and say, how much edge habitat do we have, let's say, between riparian of a certain kind of structure and composition of species with a certain width and a certain length down the river that's next to marsh that's actually functionally, hydrologically functional. So that's the kind of thing we had to get to really analyze the landscape in a way that would relate more directly to these functions. And so it turned out to be a very intensive process of understanding the biology and then interpreting that as change in the landscape. And so these are the desired ecological functions that we came up with at the end. This was our final list, and this is what's in our report that's coming out in a couple of weeks. And so what's important about that is we try to provide some visions about how you could get these functions back. So, for example, supporting edge wildlife or supporting more productivity in the food web. And so now we'll look at a few of these change analyses to see how we applied landscape science to understand the change. And this is just purely looking at habitat types. You see the map of the historical on the left and the modern in the middle. And without even looking at the bar chart, you can see that there's been pretty much a trade over of green for pink, which is marsh, mostly tidal marsh, for agriculture. And I think at a simple level, that's a really good base understanding of what's happened here. They're both very productive kinds of habitat or land use. But one serviced native wildlife and the other services mainly people, although, you know, there's some really neat stuff going on with wildlife-friendly agriculture as well. And that's what the bar chart shows, again, is just the change in those 2 major habitat types or land uses, and then also some minor changes that we'll talk about some more. So one of the ways that we, and I'll get to our conceptual model in a few minutes, one of the ways that we think about landscape change is not just change in habitat types or extents or their configuration on the landscape, that's part of it, but change in the physical processes that create and maintain those landforms. So those habitats, you know, in a lot of our lifetimes, if you created a marsh, it might remain a marsh. You know, for the last 20 or 30 years, that was true, since we've been doing a lot of wetland restoration in California. But now things are changing, especially with climate change, and we can't expect that by creating static habitat types anymore, we're actually going to maintain that place, creating that kind of function over time. Instead, we have to realize that if we need to actually probably restore the underlying physical forces that make that habitat resilient. So, for example, if you want to restore a marsh, you may need to restore the sediment supply and the tidal action that allows that marsh to accrete and grow vertically as sea level rises. That's certainly one thing we think about a lot in the Bay. It's going to be just as relevant in the Delta. So similarly, we want to think about some of the flooding processes that were really critical for creating and maintaining habitats in the Delta. And if we look at the historical map here on the left, the different colors of blue are all different kinds of flooding that used to happen. And that dark purpley blue in the north and the south, that was that basin flooding I mentioned before. It was pretty deep, a few feet deep. It lasted a pretty long time, several weeks to a few months. And you can see that it covered extensive areas and actually flooded earlier in the Sacramento than the San Joaquin. So pretty huge resource there in terms of activating food webs, those food webs remaining active while the water was still on the land for several months, and then they would drain slowly over time, and the fish could get back into the creeks or in the rivers. In the middle of the Delta, that medium blue is tidal flooding, so that was flooding every day, more or less, and it covered a vast extent. And around the edges of the delta, you see that light blue. That was more intermittent, shallow, seasonal flooding. So these are things like wet meadows, and those floods would be kind of coming off and on with different rain events over the winter and spring. So you can see that, and you see there's also some basin flooding in the Cosumnes. So you can see that this is there's just a huge amount of inundation. The wetland was wet a lot of the time, and it was also extremely productive. We all know from recent research how important floodplains are for wildlife. And this situation was sort of creating food all the time. Almost at any time of year, something was flooding, certainly the tidal areas. But a lot of the basin flooding actually happened for many months because of the complex timing. And so this was essentially a food resource that was there for California wildlife almost all the time. And you could go to different places because of the complex nature of the landscape. You could go to a different place to eat in a wet year or dry year or hot year or a cool year. There was a lot of complexity of the resource that allowed wildlife to pick and choose based on the conditions. So this is what flooding looks like now, and not every year. These are both pretty much representations of fairly wet years. You can see that the dark blue color, that purpley blue basin flooding, is essentially 100% gone. There's almost none of that. The tidal flooding, that medium blue in the middle, is almost 100% gone. I'll show you some data on that in a minute. And what we have left is a little bit of that light blue flooding in the Yolo bypass, and there's also some of the Cosumnes, so some of that more short-term, not so deep seasonal flooding. What I like about that is, and this is, I forget, 1997, I think this is El Nino, when the Yolo really, this is like a big flood in the Yolo bypass. And what I like about this is that it makes us realize that those are real successes. The Cosumnes and the Yolo bypass are really functional pieces of landscape. They do a lot for wildlife when they flood. And so even though we're not going anywhere near the historical condition, we can make a big change by creating these temporary habitats that provide a lot of food and create these places for wildlife to go and to spawn and to eat. So I actually think, although this exemplifies how much complexity we've lost and how much process we've lost, it also shows how much we can get back with just a few actions. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this work, but just to remind you that fish that grow in a floodplain grow much faster, and therefore they're much bigger. These are salmon before they go out to sea, whereas those that are reared in channels don't have as much food, and so they're not floodplain fatties, as they're called. So now let's look at the change in marsh. This map is of all marsh. I'm going to talk about all marsh and tidal marsh. So the very north and south ends of the delta, historically, those marshes were not tidal. This is our historical marsh extent. It's probably hard to see some of the green, Liberty Island, and then little remnant bits here and there. And so what you can see is that most of the marsh is gone, about 98% loss of tidal marsh, about 99% loss of marsh overall. Now let's take a quick look at riparian. So here's the historical riparian, both 100 meters wide, which we probably think of as wide now, and then the really wide stuff, the really big gallery forests that were 500 meters wide. And what I noticed a lot about this is, there was a lot more of it than we see today, but it was also in a very coherent pattern. It was sort of like these hands reaching from the north and south into the delta. And so these were corridors. You could, if you were a terrestrial animal that wanted to get into the marsh to eat, you could very consistently follow the riparian corridor and basically have that edge all the way along, and it was a route through the delta. If we look at riparian now, again, it's mostly gone, and unfortunately the slide lost the numbers on that, but it's about, I wish I could remember. I think there's maybe 25% left greater than 100 meters wide, and I forget the statistic for 500 meters wide. But even more importantly, a lot of it's gone really, really heavily impacted on the Sacramento in particular. Those are all the nice dry places, right? So that's where people wanted to live. That's where we wanted to put our orchards. It makes a lot of sense that those natural levees are being used for other things. But the other piece is that you can't even see most of the riparian. There's actually a lot of bits of riparian all over the place, but they're not in a pattern that makes sense. They're on artificial levees, kind of scattershot everywhere. And so it isn't a coherent landscape anymore. If you're wildlife trying to get to a marsh or trying to get to the other side of the delta, you're just sort of lost among all these little bits. There's no with the exception of the Casumnus and a little bit here in the San Joaquin. There's none of that historic riparian that can guide you in the way that it used to. And now let's look briefly at open water. This is a complex habitat to talk about because not all open water is the same. A lot of the types of aquatic habitats that were in the Delta before are actually mostly gone, and we have a lot of new novel habitat types. A lot of them are highly invaded by non-native species. And so it's not a simple thing to just say this is apples and apples. But looking just overall at how much shallow water habitat there is now compared to historically, there's about 2 times as much now as historically. And so I think that's really interesting with a lot of the focus that there was, at least, in the past 10 or 20 years, on the need to restore more shallow water habitat to make food for fish. This map doesn't necessarily imply that that's going to help, and I'll talk a little bit more about that for the food web in a minute. I think thinking about what are the changes in the types of shallow water habitat and what are they adjacent to, and how much do they flood, those kinds of things are probably those process-based, landscape-based approaches are going to help us answer this question. So let's get into that a little bit. Let's talk about how the channels have changed. So here's the historical channel network. This doesn't even actually get down to the first order channels. This is just what could be mapped from the historical data. You can see that you've got a lot of those really dendritic, arterial-like, capillary-like networks that basically fed the marshes. They brought the water in, took the water away, a lot of exchange of materials and energy and biota in those tidal cycles. Here's the modern marshes, so back and forth there. There's actually been quite a bit of change in the form. Here's the modern channels. There's actually been quite a lot of change in the form of the channels. If you look at where the gray and the blue overlap, that's where there's a concordance of the historical and model channel network, historical and modern channel network. But you can see that a lot of the really small channels, those more capillary-like channels that fed the marshes, those are gone because the marshes are gone, right? They've been turned into agriculture. And in addition to that, we've added a lot of these cross-channel cuts to make it easier to get around and to move water around. And so we've really changed the plumbing of the system, and it's pretty dramatic to think about. I think it's always hard for us because we're terrestrial animals, so like we breathe air and it's hard to know what's going on underwater. But I think the change in the aquatic habitat is just as extreme as the change in the wetlands and the uplands. It's just that we've homogenized it, and to an extent that we, as terrestrial animals, we don't really appreciate that change. So where we used to have, small channels with probably very turbid water in marshes, a lot of overhang of the vegetation, probably very cool places to hide, little puddles and things where the water would stay when the tide drained out. That's all gone, and now what we mostly have is these very lake-like large channels. They're very connected, the water moves through them quickly. It's almost as much 100% transformation as we've done with the wetlands. It's just as harder for us, I think, to perceive that change. So getting into, I said I would talk a little bit about primary production in the food web. So using these historical habitat layers, we were lucky enough to be able to, with some funding from the Delta Science Program and USGS, to be able to invite a bunch of primary producer experts from around the country to come and give their opinion of what they thought that change in those habitat types would mean in terms of primary production. And so out of that workshop came this hypothesis of how much primary productivity there used to be from different primary producer groups historically and now. And so, phytoplankton, this light blue color, has been so much the focus of thinking in the Delta because this is kind of the productivity we have left for wildlife. We have the channels. And so we've thought about what grows in the channels, phytoplankton. But there are actually historically these many other primary producers, and they're still here today in lesser numbers, and they contributed a really large part of the total portfolio of food that was available for primary consumers. And so I think this, in and of itself, is a little bit of a paradigm shift to think about what are the ways that we could think about food for all different wildlife in the Delta. How should it be? Do we need more shallow water habitat with phytoplankton, or do we need other kinds of primary producers? And so one big thing that you see that's changed is the loss of marsh productivity. Even though a lot of this wouldn't have been very available to consumers because it was plant-based, so it was, not as nutritious as algae, not as easy to eat. It was associated with a lot of non-phytoplankton microalgae. So all the algae that lives on the plants and on the sediment of the marsh, all that is also gone. And the detritus that comes out of the marsh and does get broken down, when you have this much, that detritus and the things that are eating the detritus, which are more nutritious and easy to eat, that's still a significant amount of food just because the total amount was so huge. And then I think another interesting question from this hypothesis that we put together from the workshop is SAV and FAV. How much did it used to matter historically? We don't really have good data on that. And what use is that? How do we think about the very productive SAV, FAV that's out there now? It's got algae associated with it also. It's got problems associated with it also. But I think it sort of brings us to think about the whole portfolio at once instead of just focusing on one piece of it. So the two hypotheses that came out of this were, one, that we've lost all this marsh-based production that might actually be valuable to various kinds of wildlife, and two, that we've lost this diversity, that having these many different sources might have been valuable to wildlife as conditions change. And we don't, three of those sources are just so small now. It's hard to imagine them being important in the food web. And we're going to be doing some follow-up work to have a workshop on this to talk more about it, share these results with managers in the spring, and then hopefully get funded to take this from hypothesis to actual calculations and conclusions. Okay, so as we move toward coming up with some visions for restoration, we wanted to make sure that we weren't doing kind of a parochial science exercise that only people in California or the Bay Area would appreciate where it came from and what it was about. And so we were able to draw on some experts in landscape resilience from the academic world, and they helped us in collaboration. We wrote a paper where we tried to synthesize all the landscape science from the literature around the world on resilience and put that into a really practical, operationalized pamphlet for people who are trying to do restoration on the ground. And so that's our landscape resilience framework. It's now being turned into a manuscript. Our co-authors are down here. So we have some of the big thinkers in landscape resilience: Richard Hobbs, Eric Higgs, Katie Suding, Erica Zavaleta, Mark Anderson. So we're just really lucky, I think, to be able to work with this group and make sure that what we're doing is really based on the best available science and not just some local ideas. And so these are the 7 principles we came up with. You're not going to find them to be totally new. The whole point was to synthesize the somewhat esoteric literature and ground it in real things that people could do on the landscape here in the Delta. So setting, process, connectivity, diversity and complexity, redundancy, scale, and people. And I'll walk through a little bit how we applied these. But I think an interesting one that we've gotten a lot of pushback on, I guess maybe 2. One is redundancy. Trying to create redundant functions in the Delta or taxonomic groups or habitat patches, there's been pushback. People haven't necessarily been wanting to create enough space for that to happen here, or people weren't always thinking that way that we needed to have that. So I think that's one of the ways that getting out to the academic literature can be helpful. Another one is scale. The size of what we think needs to happen sometimes is bigger than what's been conceived of in the past. And a lot of that is based on making sure that we have the right scale of physical process, right scale of habitat patches so that physical processes can function. And I'll show you an example in a minute. And also time scale, that we can't expect restoration to happen in 5 years. Not to mention the permitting, there's also the actual physical processes. You need to allow habitats to evolve. You need to allow plant succession to happen. So trying to let that be okay, that these natural processes are going to take more space and more time than we might like. And I'm just going to walk through setting very briefly. So this is our first principle, that you really have to know your place. You don't want to just restore willy-nilly. You have to think about where you are. And so if under setting our goal is to restore tidal marshland, then we would want to, so we've decided here we are in the Delta, it used to be one big marsh, let's restore some tidal marshland for the reasons we already talked about, to support biodiversity, including primary production. then what do we need to think about in terms of process for that restoration? We need to be in the right elevation. We need to think about, you know, what's going to happen over time with climate change and sediment supply. Is that marsh going to be sustainable and resilient? Do you have the hydrology? Do you have the tidal range to make a sustainable tidal marsh there? And then you want to make sure that you have freshwater and sediment connected to the watershed. So it's not just a tidal process from the bay, but it's also a watershed process looking upstream. You want to think about the connectivity with both the terrestrial area nearby, so you're going to need these broad transition zones to the terrestrial areas, and you're going to need to think about connectivity between marshes themselves. So if you can't put big marshes near each other, then you need to put small stepping stones in between them to link them up. Diversity and complexity, it's not just marshes in the North Delta or marshes in the South Delta. You have to restore them across key physical gradients of elevation and salinity if you want to get that complexity and diversity of function in the marshes. And here's that redundancy that we talked about. You're probably going to need redundancy of large marshes, migration routes, especially for fish. That's a tough one to find space for. Floodplains and other key landscape elements. So it's not just one big marsh will do the trick. And then scale. We already talked about this, planning for marshes to evolve over time, including migration with sea level rise, and then thinking about restoring soon, so restored areas have enough time to evolve and become resilient before sea level rise really gets going. And then, of course, making sure you still have enough tidal range, so there's some big trade-offs here. And then people. People are the crux of this whole ecosystem that we're talking about, the Delta. And so really making sure that the local stakeholders and other stakeholders here in California, there's a lot of stakeholders in the Delta that don't live here as well. And so involving those people in the process so they can appreciate why these things are important and how they should be done most efficiently. And so from this landscape resilience framework, we would then come up with a conceptual model. This is an old one. I'll show you a more updated one in a minute. Okay, so getting on to our report that's coming out soon, we had a really simple conceptual model that underlies it to try to help people think about what are the expectations of what we can get back and what are we really trying to do here. So we're trying to think about this system as there are these physical processes and those interact with the landscape. And so this is the historical view of the conceptual model. The landscape used to be intact. That's what the green box is supposed to show. It used to be complex also, but it was too hard to get this into our box. And then from the interaction of physical process with landscape, you get these ecological functions that you want from it. So what's happening now? We've interrupted a lot of the physical processes. We've changed the flows, we've changed the flooding, we've changed the sediment supply, the way things are connected. We've broken up the landscape, but fragmented a lot of the wetlands, homogenized a lot of the waterscape, so converse actions there, created novel habitat types and land uses. And so we're not getting all the ecological functions anymore. Some of them are all the way gone. Some of them are sort of stuttering along. What's the idea with restoration? The idea with restoration is we can restore some of the physical processes, not all the way to the historical level, but enough that that can then interact with the landscape where we've restored habitat. We've created redundant patches, large patches, connectivity, all the things I was talking about. And that can help us bring back the functions that we want. So the point of this is to illustrate that we can get what we want without trying to return to historical conditions, and I think that's what is often misunderstood about this kind of investigation. The purpose is to regain desired ecological functions, and the approach is to restore physical processes and landscape elements. And I just wanted to touch on flows because it's something that our reports don't talk about a lot. We refer to it without actually prescribing what the flows should be. It's such a challenging issue, and there's so much other research on it. So I just wanted to briefly talk that this is some data from the State of the Estuary report in 2015. Just briefly talk about how flows have changed, because that's such an important process that's been altered over time. So this is looking at what gets into the bay, so what flows from the delta into the bay as % of unimpaired over time, since we had records starting in the 30s. And you can see that in general that we have a lot of variability in our climate, but in general there's this slow decline over time. These data were analyzed by Tina Swanson of NRDC, and some people take issue with that because NRDC is an advocacy organization. So we don't need to talk about what the colors mean. I think that's a lot of the interpretation of the data, but the data are just the data. So I don't think anyone would argue with where the data points fall on this graph. You can see that slow decline over time. And just so you know, these yellowy-orange bands are severe droughts. And so what a severe drought used to mean in the 30s, before we had a lot of water infrastructure, was really different than what a severe drought means now. So there's nothing less severe about this drought than this one in 2014, or sorry, 2009. It's just the change in water infrastructure and water use that's caused that decline. Same data averaged by decade, so you can see the decline more clearly. And the colors are just condition that Tino assigned to the data. And here's what 2014 looked like. We all know that was a really tough year for water in California. The solid blue is unimpaired, and the red line is actual. So again, we're looking at freshwater inflow to the bay. That's a really extreme change to a physical process in an estuary that's driven by fresh water. So I think when we see these kind of data, we have to expect really extreme changes in the functions that you're getting downstream of this. And I say that without blaming anyone, but I think sometimes when we talk about this, it feels like we're attacking ag or we're attacking cities or we're attacking Southern California. And it's not about that. It's just showing the straight up data of how much transformation there's been, just like we show how much marsh loss or how much flooding loss has happened. This is about half of the water being taken out of the system in 2014. And then this one I really like to think about ecologically. So here we're looking at all the data, again, across time. And the data have now been categorized so that very dry years, which means the lowest 20% of the most dry 20% of all the years, I don't know how to describe that very well, the years in which we're at the lowest fifth of water, those are categorized in red, and there's two red categories. The light red category is kind of orange. You can see it poking out of the top of some of these red bars. That's what would have been categorized as very dry in a place that didn't have all of our water infrastructure, where we were taking water out of the system. So you can see that those happened. You know, earlier in the century, there was a few decades here where there really weren't any dry years, or wouldn't have been naturally. And then there's some other clumps of drought, essentially here, natural drought. The dark red, and you can see there's a lot more dark bars, that's when we're creating a very dry year. Because of all the water that's getting taken out of the system, the bay is experiencing a drought. There's not very much water coming into the bay from the delta. And you can see that that's about, it comes out to be about 2.5 to 3 times more than there would be naturally. So we're creating a chronic artificial drought all the time. And these kinds of decades where we could have seen our system recover and our populations of wildlife recover, they can't, because they're being forced into a drought that they wouldn't normally experience. So that's a really huge evolutionary challenge for a species that's been evolved to deal with only the light red bars of drought, is now dealing with all the dark red bars of drought. And it's another way of thinking about the challenges that we're putting into our system, and that we'll have to address, I think, in restoration. Okay, so very briefly, I'll just talk about the report that's coming out. Here's our desired ecological functions. We already talked about them from the Delta Transformed report. We're using the same exact ones, and we're offering visions for how you could get these functions back. So we have spreads that talk about, if you want to support marsh wildlife, for example, here's how you might want to configure the landscape. And this gets into particular habitat types and where they might go in the delta without trying to assign any particular parcel or, landowners to what would happen, but just to get a sense of how big would the patches be, what would they be adjacent to, where in the delta would they need to be, how much redundancy would you be thinking about. And we have exaggerated the size of these patches so that you can see them, especially the little bits. And you can see that pink, which is managed wetlands and wildlife-friendly agriculture, is a really big part of it. It's not just totally natural areas. It's integrating more ecosystem function of that kind in natural places with the working landscape we already have. So to get these ecological functions, you need to have that landscape configuration, but then you need to get down to the nitty-gritty of what are you going to do in a particular small place. And so that's where we've come up with strategies for restoring processes, because we have a very process-based conceptual model that you saw. But then you need to fit these strategies together. Each one of these bolded names is a strategy. You need to fit them together in particular places to get that more small-scale landscape configuration that can give you the functions you want. So for example, this is still about restoring landscapes that can support marsh wildlife. You would need to reestablish marsh processes at intertidal elevations. You would need to do some subsidence reversal. You would need to do some wildlife-friendly agriculture. You'd need to reestablish fluvial processes. That's how you're going to feed those marshes with sediment and energy and fresh water. And then you need to think about that transition zone so that during high water events, your wildlife have a place to go for refuge, and you also have that marsh migration space over time as sea level rises. So that's just one example, and we have these kinds of schematics for all of our desired functions. And then we get into a lot of detail about what are these process-based strategies, trying to give a lot of guidance for how this could be done based on the science that's out there. And so these are about restoring processes in the tidal zone, in that tidal fluvial interfaces, all those deltas that come into the big delta. Restoring the fluvial processes way up at the ends of the rivers, sort of before they enter the tidal zone. And then not forgetting, because we're so focused on the aquatic in the delta, that there are important terrestrial and transition zone processes too. So we need to connect the delta to the terrestrial areas. And then integrating all these ecological ideas with human land uses. So thinking about cities, thinking about agriculture, how do we make these pieces work together? And so we have spreads and maps that try to help people see where the opportunity areas could be. This is just enlarging the map a little bit. You know, where do you have the right elevations? Where do you have adjacency to the right habitats? Where do you have public land that might be a good place to get started? And then we try to give really specific guidance on what are the size of the patches, how should they be organized next to each other, what might you get if you restored one thing versus another. Not trying to say this is what you should do, but here's the options you have and here's what the science says you might get if you make different choices. So here's an example. We're still thinking about restoring marshes for wildlife. So one of our guidelines for restoring marsh-based processes is marshes should be as big as possible. That's a nice idea, but what does it actually mean? So what we try to do is say, well, here's what you might get if you restore marshes of different sizes. At around 2 hectares, you might get a black rail showing up. A black rail is a small marsh bird. At 100 hectares, you might get an actual population of black rails that's reached their maximum density. So there you might be doing some service to wildlife that matters, and that might be really good for a stepping stone. At 500 hectares, you're getting a patch size that's big enough that you get the full tidal channel network. You get that dendritic network of channels that bring water and energy and food in and out of your marsh. So that's the sort of process-based size that we would ideally want so that we get self-sustaining functional systems. Whereas these kind of marshes may not be able to actually deliver enough sediment to themselves to be able to maintain their elevation as sea level rises. And yet, even at 500 hectares, we're not really coming close to the historical average patch size. Average patch size was 4,500 hectares historically, and maximum patch size historically was 110,000 hectares. So again, just to point out that we can get quite a bit without going to the incredible, vast, extreme wetland sizes and functions that we used to have. And I'll just leave you with the thought, sort of getting back to people here a little bit at the end, that this is a big blueprint. It's a big guide to try to help you how landscape science can help with the decisions that need to be made. But it needs to be translated into much smaller, we call these OLUs. It's just meant to mean what are the planning areas that we should be thinking about to create more local visions and involve stakeholders. And that's what Department of Fish and Wildlife is doing now, and Delta Conservancy is doing these much smaller scale visioning processes where our ideas hopefully can be, from landscape science, can be applied. And so again, I think as we think about this beautiful historic landscape that we used to have and the productive and valuable landscape that we have now that's providing a lot of water and food for our state, we can imagine that there's an integrated future that can service both. Not that it will be easy, but that it is possible, and hopefully there's some win-wins here. And by using landscape science, hopefully we can make our restoration as effective and efficient as possible so that we're not doing an uncoordinated approach that's going to end up taking a lot more land and a lot more time. Whereas if we do a thoughtful, scientific, coordinated approach across large scales, we can actually get what we want using the least land and water. and still getting the most ecological function. So I want to thank everyone who funded this work and the co-authors on the Bay Delta Science paper, and thanks to all of you for listening. I'd love to have questions if there's time.
There's certainly time for some questions.
Hi, Letitia. Great talk, as always. Good to hear from you again. Can you speak at all about any input you've had or any thinking you've done with the California Conservation Cooperative and anything to do with the Central Valley Landscape Project?
Oh, that's a great question. You know, we haven't done a lot with that. I think that's the kind of thing that I think needs to happen in this next phase is, you know, for better or for worse, our mandate was to a little bit go off alone into the land of science and make a vision without a lot of influence and sort of a lot of political influence and pressure to change it. And so for better or for worse, we've come back with that, but I think now is the time to actually integrate this much more with the real world and the plans that are out there right now. So that's a great idea.
Question about decision. I'd like to hear more on your decision to not have Sassoon Marsh as part of it, and so I kind of want to exclude it from the landscape. Is it a separate landscape? I mean, you know, I kind of like to hear more about that. I mean, it's a marshland managed in certain ways. Is it separate?
Yeah, great question. To me, the whole estuary is one system, and it's always confusing to me that we as people need to divide it up so we can cope, and that's also how we've organized our governance of it. So, no, I don't think it's a separate system, and I wouldn't stop at Sassoon. It goes, you know, there is definitely a corridor right through the North Bay to the Golden Gate, and it's all connected. And when we did the State of the Estuary report, we saw impacts to fish populations all the way through North Bay related to water being taken out of the delta. Are we evacuating? It's just a phone. Okay, good. Okay. All right. Well, let us know if we need to do something. So, no, I think, you know, based on the science, it's one system. The reason we didn't include Sassoon in this report is, A, we weren't asked to, we weren't funded to, and B, we didn't have the historical ecology for Sassoon at the time. And so we couldn't have done the same kind of analysis across that full landscape. I think the one justification we can make is because of that physical constriction where the two rivers come together, and the fact that mostly you're pretty much looking at fresh water, everything upstream from there, it is sort of a unit within the overall estuary that's reasonable to tackle separately. Someone behind you.
So, how much of this do you think are we going to have to move this up into the Central Valley, up the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers? What's your thought on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot is possible. So here's the map that shows how much, all those different colors of green is how much land is at intertidal elevation now or will be at intertidal elevations with 6 feet of sea level rise. So if this land were available for restoration, and I'm not saying it is, but there's a lot of acreage out there that's at the right elevation. I think our challenges are more financial and political than actually having enough land at the right elevation. Over time, I mean, obviously over long time periods, depending on how much sea level rises, we might need to go into the valley. The other piece is, you know, the delta doesn't have the science yet. Do we have enough sediment supply? Where's the marsh accretion modeling? You know, those pieces of science aren't available yet to be able to say, well, if you build a marsh here and you don't change anything about sediment supply, this is how long it's going to last. We don't know that yet, and that's something we desperately need to know. And then after we know that, we need to think about how we're managing sediment and manage it differently. And that's a really big institutional and cultural challenge, I think, for us with the infrastructure that we have set up in terms of how we manage our watersheds. So when we get to that point, it's not going to be just about the delta anymore. You're going to be saying, well, why didn't you do the whole watershed? Why didn't, forget Sassoon, like why didn't you do, you know, all the way up to the tops of the Sierras and how we're managing dams and how we're managing flows through the Central Valley and how we're managing flooding. And, you know, we've altered the whole giant system so much that I think if we want this part, the downstream end of the system, to function really well, we have to think about fixing the whole system. But I feel like it's baby steps. You know, or at least one thing at a time. They're not baby steps, but it's one thing at a time.
So I got a
kind of a weird question for you. So for the near term, next, say, 20, 30 years, and then if you're thinking about the restoration in terms of intertidal or the wetland restoration in the Delta, you're talking about more of a patches instead of overall landscape patterns. So if you're talking about a certain patch or certain size of patch, and if you're designing a restoration project, what would be your, say, target function, target species, or target community? And I would think that would be the driving force behind the size of a patch. So I'm just asking your opinion, not actually any scientific answer.
That's interesting for me personally. My Ph.D. was on tidal marsh birds that have these really tiny, I forget, they're several to a hectare. So you get several breeding pairs per hectare. I'm glad I forgot by now. I guess it's been a long time since I finished my dissertation. So I guess to me, I wouldn't think that way anymore at all. I would think, what is the size of the patch I need to create a sustainable system based on physical process? So I would probably go for this 500 hectare. You know, if we want to, I think what we need is big things. That doesn't mean every project needs to be that big. It means if we're shooting for that as our long-term goal, different projects can come in and start to create pieces of that, because that's when we're going to get those channel networks. That is really what we need to create those marshes. They're going to be there, you know, if we get enough sediment supply to sustain themselves over with sea level rise. I'm just not sure that these smaller marshes that don't get fully channelized really are going to have the energy and the sediment delivery that can make them self-sustaining. And if you don't have that, then you don't have whatever your target species was, you know, decades down the road anyway. So I think it's really trying to help us shift, you know, the Endangered Species Act, I'm all for it. I think it's saved a lot of species, which I think is great. But it's not set up for the current situation that we're facing. And so I think we need to have this really long-term thinking about if we want to have the species around in the future, we actually have to have the processes and the landscape that supports it.
So before everyone goes, I want to make a quick plug for our upcoming Science Enterprise Workshop, which is occurring next week at UC Davis. Please, on your way out, pick out a program, and if you think you'd be interested in attending, please register through the event page on the Delta Stewardship Council website. And then a couple weeks after that, we have the Bay Delta Science Conference. Registration is open for that. And do not miss the Town Hall special lunch event, which will include a game of Delta Family Feud. Thanks, Letitia.